Hi everyone, my name is Zali Yeager and I'm Senior Lecturer in Health and Physical Education here at VU. I'm making a video today about something I'm really passionate about, which is using evidence-based resources in health education. So when I'm talking about evidence-based resources, there's three main things that I'm talking about. Either there's evidence that the resource is effective, or the resources are made based on a strong evidence base, or there's evidence of what works and what doesn't, or what's harmful, and the resource fits in with these guidelines. So I'm going to use some examples today to explain the three different types of evidence and how that might guide your choice of programs and your choice of resources in health education. I've also put together this table where I went through the 6 focus areas of the health curriculum. I put in the inclusions from the Australian curriculum just to make sure that it's representative Australia-wide, but you can have a look at how that differs for Victoria. And I've then put in links to some of the key evidence-based resources that are existing at the moment, and some of the readings that you might do to inform your knowledge about that area, or some of the readings that show the evidence for the use of these resources. So that's a separate table that you can have a look at in the module. So when I'm talking about evidence-based resources, I think that it's just such a good idea when you're going to teach a certain area that you would look up resources that have an evidence base instead of Googling or finding a resource, that might be based in a textbook or something. The reason for this is that experts in that area have been working for a long time and have a lot of knowledge around a certain area. And when they've developed a resource, it's based on maybe 20 or 30 years of history and of study and of theoretical foundations to guide behaviour change, basically. And so that's something that you could never learn all of that when you don't have time to really learn all of that when you're going to go teach something. So it's much easier if you just get a resource that's based on evidence, because then you know that it will probably have a greater effect on your students' learning and your students' behaviour. One such example of a resource for alcohol use is the SHARP resources. These have a harm minimisation focus, and there's lots of lessons that you would teach in a particular order and at a particular year level because they're developmentally appropriate. There's teacher and student manuals, you can download it for free. They did a lot of research around this resource, so they've actually evaluated the impact and they have looked at what it has done for adolescents. So I've included the abstract here to kind of give us a little sense of what they've done. So they went in and they did a survey with students before they gave them this program and then afterwards. They included 2,300 students, which is quite a lot, in Perth, Western Australia. They gave them this intervention, which is the SHARP resources, and they measured their knowledge, attitudes, alcohol consumption, and harms associated with their own and other people's use of alcohol. What they found is that the intervention group gained in knowledge over the from pre to post and had significantly safer alcohol-related attitudes as opposed to the students who might have been in a control group. So they were more likely to be non-drinkers or supervised drinkers than comparison students, which is a good sign, and they were less likely to drink at risky levels. So this was a huge success. Not only did the program increase the students' knowledge, it also reduced the risk of them drinking at risky levels and it reduced the harm associated with that consumption. So that's the sort of thing that you could never know. Like if you were going to Google something and you see a great idea on what to do for alcohol, for an alcohol lesson, and you think, oh yeah, I'll do that, you would never know what sort of impact it might have on students' actual alcohol consumption. But if you use this program, you know that the finding, like what would happen in your students, would probably be quite similar to the findings in this study. So another example that I'll give is in the area of body image. So I actually conducted this systematic review with my colleagues in the UK, and we had a look at all of the different programs that have ever been developed to try and improve body image in people, in young people in the school setting. So all of the classroom-based programs. And we found that there were quite a few that had been developed that were not effective and did not actually improve body image, but there were very few that did. One of those was a resource called Happy Being Me that we then worked with Dove, and they developed that into a program, and they made it much prettier, as you can only do if you've got lots of corporate money and graphic designers. So they've actually developed that into either a 5-session or a single session program. And my colleague Philippa has continued to evaluate that in the UK setting to make sure that it does actually enhance body image and reduce dieting and eating disorder symptoms. And we found that to be effective. So there's the 5-session program, and this is the evaluation study for the single session program as well, which had some positive effects. So if you've only got one lesson, you could do this single session program. It's been evaluated. We did pre-test, post-test, make sure that people improve in between, and that was found to be successful. And the 5-session program's been, that's just a poster abstract, but the paper's being submitted at the moment. Okay, so let's have a look at some resources that are based on evidence. They don't have that sort of pre-test, post-test assurance that people improved over time from a research study, but they're based heavily on well-known theoretical foundations of behaviour change in a certain area. So the most common one, and one that you really don't need to look anywhere else for your relationships education, is the 4Rs resource: resilience, rights and respectful relationships. A lot of money has gone into the development of this resource, and it's based on some very strong resources and very strong evidence. So in this, there's 8 different topics, and majority of them are sort of social and emotional learning things. And then right at the end, there's some stuff around gender and identity and positive gender relations. And those only really come into play in the later years of schooling. But this is really your go-to resource in terms of teaching about gender, teaching about relationships, and teaching about sexuality. So you can see there, this is the excerpt from inside the resource. It's a little bit cut off by the frame here. But you can see there that this is the sort of thing you would look for in a resource to know that it's based on evidence, because they're going to include this sort of blurb that's talking about all of the research that they looked at in developing the resource. So that's what this kind of gives you a sense of. And you can see that when you go to the actual resource itself, it's just inside the pages. Okay, so also it's important to access articles and things about that show you the evidence about what works in certain areas, and I've included links to a lot of these. So a really good example is this one by Helen Cahill, and it really nicely summarises evidence-based approaches to classroom drug education. Again, this is an area where, like, if you're just going to teach it and you think, oh, what you kind of go, what was effective for me, or what would I like to know if I was a young person? And it's not necessarily maybe the same as what experts in the area might suggest. So I really recommend that you read this one. In it, they basically outline, the things that don't work, which are scare tactics, normalising drug use, only targeting knowledge and not behaviour, and only building self-esteem. All of those things being found to be ineffective for drug education. And yet some of those things are the things that we might naturally go to in teaching, to give scare tactics and stuff, by watching YouTube videos or something. So we know that harm minimisation, interactive and experiential learning, problem solving, rehearsal of refusal behaviours, like, what would you do if someone offered you drugs, and deep thinking about the problem. We know that those things are effective. I've also written a paper about, in the same sort of line, in terms of eating disorders, when you're teaching about eating disorders and what sort of things might be effective and not effective. In this area, there's a huge potential to do harm if we do some of the things that don't work. So if you give a list of symptoms of eating disorder behaviours, that basically just looks like a checklist on how to lose weight. And young people who are not in a particularly rational state of mind, as adolescents maybe aren't, might see that as a useful list of things to do in order to lose weight. So we really want to avoid giving lists of symptoms. We want to avoid showing lots of media images of thin models. We have decades of research that shows that that's found that showing people images of thin models, like they literally sit people down in a lab and they show them pictures and then they measure them before and after, and they find that they have worse body image and they have worse mood and they are depressed. And so showing people images of this in the classroom is likely to have the opposite effect to what you were kind of hoping for. So we really want to discourage people from using images of thin models as a shock tactic to it. It's not going to scare people out of having an eating disorder. We really also want to discourage using stories, films, or guest speakers of people who have recovered from an eating disorder. Even though stories of the lived experience are really engaging and young people seem to sit and listen and be absorbed by it, these tend to normalise and glamorise eating disorders and sort of show adolescents that you can sort of go through it all and become a glamorous speaker at the end, being well paid to go and speak at schools. So I really want to discourage that as well. Assignments to research eating disorders is particularly problematic because the people that are drawn to do those assignments will be ones who are vulnerable to developing an eating disorder, and they'll literally be doing research on how to do that better, which is not a good idea. So what does work? Evidence-based programs to promote body image using a whole school approach. So considering even things like the PE change rooms and how that might be developing a school environment that could be supporting body image or really enhancing opportunities for teasing. Talking about eating disorders as serious psychological disorders in class is helpful. Facilitating help seeking. Butterfly Foundation has a lot of resources around this, and Teen Mental Health First Aid has a particular eating disorders approach as well. So I've talked through some different types of evidence here. We've talked about programs where there's evidence that the resource is effective. We've talked about resources that are heavily based on the research evidence, and we've talked about using some evidence regarding what works and what doesn't, or what's harmful. Hopefully you'll be able to use this sort of information so that when you're looking on Fuse for some resources, or when you're Googling, you might also use Google Scholar as well to look at evidence-based approaches to teaching alcohol, or to teaching drugs, or to teaching whatever it is that you need to teach. There's usually quite a lot on there that's freely available. So thank you so much for listening and staying with me. Have a look at that table that I've developed because it took ages, and I'm really excited about having all of those resources together, and good luck with your PE programming and pedagogy. Thanks everyone.